Now, you see, in our earlier classes, as we were dealing with the process of respiration, we had done with glycolysis, we had done with TCA and Krebs cycle. Now, ultimately, we have come to the final product that is known as the ETC. It is the final step. ETS means electron transport system, and oxidative phosphorylation. See, oxidative phosphorylation we had already done in photosynthesis also. But here you see the respiratory process. Okay, the main aim of respiratory process is oxidation of glucose, and the primary aim is it has to release the bond energy from NADH and FADH2. Okay, so now they are oxidized through an electron transport chain system, and the electron, see, we said that respiration they require oxygen. Okay, but till now oxygen was nowhere in the scene, but the oxygen plays a vital role because all that hydrogen that is released is finally accepted by O2 to produce H2O. So this is the final and the finishing step. And this is a metabolic pathway. Okay, the metabolic pathway through which the electron passes. You see, electron passes from one carrier to another, and that is why it is known as a ETS or electron transport system. Now, what is the site for electron transport system? The site for electron transport system is the inner mitochondrial membrane. Okay. Now, this inner mitochondrial membrane, what happens? You see, this NADH is reduced to NADH2 in complex 1. Okay. Now what happened? Then there is one enzyme that is known as NADH hydrogenase. So with this NADH hydrogenase, this is reduced. And see, another one is FADH2, that is also reduced to FADH positive, and this is also, see, it is from CCA. What is that? Carboxylic acid cycle. Okay. So this forms the complex 2, and it is a part 2 of it. Okay. Now here another one substrate that is known as amblycunin. So that amblycunin is again reduced in the first complex 1, and in the second, this amblycunin is oxidized. Okay. Oxidized to a cytochrome complex. Now what is cytochrome complex? Cytochrome complex, basically it is a mobile carrier. Carrier means it is a protein based compound, and it carries the electrode from the transport chain. Okay. Now here you see I have mentioned 1, 2, 3 and 4. So 1, 2 and 3 and 4, actually these are complexes. See, first one is beta cytochrome, C cytochrome, A1 and A3 cytochrome. So these are layers of membrane that forms a complex along with cytochrome. See here A1 and A3 is a copper combination with cytochrome. It's a very complex thing that is not beyond the scope of your syllabus, and there is a membrane. Then ultimately what do? They synthesize ATP. Now you see, when NADH is reduced to NADH2, and finally it produces 3 ATP, and FADH2 is reduced, so it produces 2 ATP. So these are the basic processes that reduces the ATP. Okay. Now you see, now you see that 3 basic factors that is known as glycolysis, TCA and ETS. So these are the 3 basic processes. Now if we see a rough diagram like this. Okay. Now we have already done with the proton gradient. Okay. Now here are 2 positions. Okay. One, this is the head, that is the F1, and this is the F0. So these are the pathway. This is a mitochondrial membrane. Okay, this is a rough diagram of the mitochondria, and it is there in your figure, is also there in your book. Okay, so now here it is a proton gradient, and hydrogen has to entry of is in through this path, and here an ATP is produced with the reduction of ADP plus PR. Okay, so this is the entry and this creates a proton gradient. So this is also a part of this phosphorylation. So when the hydrogen enters through this layer, then only ATP is synthesized, ADP, and phosphate is released. So this is actually the energy producing process. Now if we simply condense the process of photosynthesis, we come to know that these are the three basic processes: glycolysis, TCA and ETS. So first, after the glycolysis, TCA follows, and from TCA, ETS. Now here, so main thing is only one molecule of glucose is involved. Okay, so from one molecule of glucose, it is 38 molecules of ATP that is produced. Okay, and in fermentation, see, it is a very slow process and it produces 2 ATP and it is a very slow respiratory process. So that is why the impartial breakdown is also there and energy gain is less, because this is anaerobic and this is aerobic. Now you know, aerobic respiration is always takes place in the presence of oxygen, but oxygen here involved is the final proton acceptor, electron acceptor, and it is at the terminal procedure, but the presence of oxygen is very, very vital. Okay, now you see the method by which hydrogen is removed from the entire system, it takes place during photosynthesis. That means light, that is photophosphorylation. Now see, this phosphorylation and respiration is an oxido reduction. That means one is oxidized and the other is reduced. Okay, so that is why it is known as the reductase, oxidation reduction, redox reaction. Now here it happens parallel to it, and there is no particular, in living organism, there is no particular demarcation that first glycolysis has to complete, then the TCA has to complete, and then the ETS has to be complete. Okay, now one thing you see during respiration, okay, first the primary substrate, okay, primary substrate is glucose. Is glucose. But you know, other substances like fats and proteins also has to converted or rather broken down to enter the respiratory pathway. Okay, now for example, fat. Okay, fat is broken down into fatty acid and glycerol. Okay, now this glycerol ultimately, you know, gets converted into PGAL. That means what? Phosphoglyceraldehyde. So this glycerol PGA has to enter in the respiratory pathway. But when you know the organism requires the glycerol, it can reverse back. Okay, this can be again converted into glycerol. Okay, clear? And another thing, you know, this protein is broken down into acetyl coenzyme A. This acetyl coenzyme A, and again it enters into the respiratory pathway. So since it can happen with glucose, it can happen with fatty acid and protein, it is known as amphibolic, AMPHIBOLIC, amphibolic. Amphibolic means dual. Okay, this is known as an amphibolic pathway. That means it happens both with both the substrate of fats and protein. Now ultimately, finally, we come to a point that is known as respiratory quotient. Now what is respiratory quotient? CO2 released by O2 taken or consumed. So that is known as RQ, respiratory quotient. Okay. Now this respiratory quotient is 1. Okay. RQ is equal to 1 when the substrate is glucose. If it is fats, it is 0.07 for fats and it is 0.9 in case of proteins. That means what? This glucose production, glucose if it uses as a substrate, the respiratory quotient is 1, that means maximum amount of energy is released. With fat, little less, 0.7, and with protein, very little amount of energy is released. So ultimately with this we come to the end of the total respiration in plant, and we have come through, we have discussed the glycolysis, we have discussed the TCA, we have discussed the ETS, that is electron transport system. Then basically you see, first part, when the glucose is broken down into carbon dioxide and water, it is known as a catabolism. But when proteins and fat, okay, they go into the reverse, we call it as anabolism. Okay, so ultimately we have come together the metabolic pathway. We have seen how in other than glucose, other substrates can be also entering the respiratory pathway. Then we know that this is an amphibolic system where proteins and fats can also be oxidized to produce carbon dioxide and water. And then finally we came to the RQ, that is respiratory quotient. It is a ratio of carbon dioxide released and oxygen taken. If it is 1, the substrate is glucose, but it is 0.7 in case of fats, and it is 0.9 in case of protein. Okay.